without further ado, I want to welcome Jared Duval, who is the Executive Director of the Energy Action Network, who again is going to ground us in the latest data and facts so that we know where we are falling short, what we need to do, and how we can help him and how we can all work together to make the change that we need to see. So Jared, thank you. Do you know how to do this? Okay.
Thank you, Joey. Good morning, VECAN. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here with you this morning for a number of reasons. One is, as Joey said, I look forward to this conference every year because it's a chance to be surrounded by leaders who are at the forefront of our energy transition, and because it's a chance to come back to my hometown. I grew up right here in Fairleigh. I was one of the luckiest kids in Vermont. I actually grew up across the street from the Whippy Dip. So for any of you who are local, you know that that's some of the best creamies you can get. So I'm really glad to be back here. As Joey said, I'm Jared Duval with the Energy Action Network. I'm going to ground us in some just basic information that a lot of you are familiar with, but there's a lot here, and every time I look at it, I learn something more. And a word about Energy Action Network. We are a diverse network of businesses, organizations, colleges and universities, fuel dealers, utilities, any organization or entity in Vermont that wants to help us make progress towards our renewable energy goals, specifically those that the state has committed to in our comprehensive energy plan. Folks know that by the headline often of 90% renewable by 2050. We also have important emissions reduction commitments that the state has made that we work to make progress toward together. So that network is over 100 members, including VECAN, and many of the towns and cities that make up VECAN, and also many public partners who we work with, state agencies and departments across Vermont to help the network achieve its mission. And so this is the mission that the network has established, which is to achieve Vermont's 90% renewable by 2050 total energy commitment and significantly reduce Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions in ways that create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. So in service of that network and that mission, a small nonprofit organization, we call ourselves a backbone organization, serve the network in a number of ways. We serve as a neutral convener, so we don't do any lobbying on bills or policy. We try to bring diverse perspectives together as a neutral convener, and we also make sure that our conversations as a state are grounded in data and evidence so that we can best inform programs and policies and how we're going to meet these goals that we've set. So we collect data and measure results, share analysis out with the network in the state of Vermont in a number of ways. Hopefully many of you are familiar with our annual progress report, which there are copies of upstairs, also on that table in that corner of the room. Take as many as you want. We're getting towards the point where we're about to release our 2019 annual progress report in March. So we're not holding on to these for any reason. Take as many as you want, share them with your friends and neighbors, and please stay tuned for the publication of our next annual progress report with updated data in March. I want to say a word about our team. So Carolyn Wesley is our network manager. Carolyn, do you mind standing up and saying hi? Pamela Hathaway is also here, who's our new energy research analyst, working with us on the annual progress report. And I see many board members and network members around the room as well. And I should also say that this year at our annual summit, we gave our annual leadership award named after two of our co-founders, Ann and Arthur Burt, to someone we all know and love, Joey Miller. So we get to recognize her again for the decade plus of commitment that she has made. Lastly, I'll just say that when we share out the data and analysis and information that we think is important to advancing and informing Vermont's energy and climate conversation, we often do that through a monthly newsletter. And if you're not getting that, feel free to sign up at eanvt.org. So our approach is to follow the data It is to listen to evidence-based expertise and then share careful, honest, and actionable analysis. Really as an objective, independent source that multiple diverse stakeholders can have trust in. And most of the data that we provide is not our own. We just do the work to help collect it and tell a comprehensive story. Wonderful, thank you for that. We share that out. We also provide for regions and towns information on the Community Energy Dashboard, vtenergydashboard.org, where you can see some more locally relevant information about energy use and about progress towards efficiency and renewables. But as I was saying before, it's really not our information. We rely on the Public Service Department, Agency of Transportation, Efficiency of Vermont, many state and Energy Information Administration, EPA. So we're really just trying to pull information together to tell a cohesive, comprehensive story about where we are and what it's going to take to get to the goals that we've committed to as a state. And we really rely on and thank the partners who enable that and make that possible. So this presentation today, I'll mention that if you want these slides or versions of them, including the notes, they are up on the EAN website, and you can find downloadable infographics and images that you can also use in your own presentations. This overview is about 4 E's: emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. I'll just start with one slide that we use to try and pull it all together, which shows energy use, emissions, and energy burden are really the costs that Vermonters pay for their energy across our different energy sectors. So no matter how you look at it, how much energy we use, where our emissions and climate pollution come from, or how much money we spend, transportation is the elephant in the room. And thermal, which includes both heating and cooling, but in Vermont is primarily how we heat our buildings and water, is not that far behind. It is 42% of our energy use, over 1/3 of our emissions, and electricity is the backbone of our ability to make progress towards our renewable energy and emissions reduction commitments. But on its own, our generation and use of electricity is a very small number in terms of our total energy use and our total emissions and the costs that we pay for energy overall. This sets the context in terms of where we are on our energy and emissions goals. So the graph that you see on the left shows that we're at about 19 or 20% renewable energy overall as a state across all energy sectors combined. And if we are going to meet our 90% renewable by 2050 commitment, now is the time when we need to be at this inflection point where we bend the curve upward. We cannot continue to rely on just getting renewable energy and emissions reductions from the electricity generation sector. We also need to realize that when we say renewable energy, solar panels are incredibly important, but the other renewable energy solutions that should also be part of that sentence are cold climate heat pumps and home weatherization and heat pump water heaters and electric vehicles and transit, et cetera, et cetera. We need to think much more broadly about the efficient and renewable solutions beyond just electricity generation, because that's where most of our fossil fuel use and emissions come from, is the transportation and thermal sectors. And because we have an increasingly renewable electric sector, it provides the backbone, the foundation of the opportunity to make more progress in those other sectors. On the emissions side, you'll remember the President declared his intention to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Governor Scott was one of the governors across the country who said, no, we're still in. Vermont is going to commit to this.
Today, by executive order, I am forming the Vermont Climate Action Commission. This commission will be advising me on specific policy recommendations to put Vermont on a path to meeting our ambitious renewable and climate change goals. Despite what's going on in Washington, I'm committed to doing our part. In response to the federal government's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, I've joined 13 other governors to affirm the state's commitment to meeting our share of the emissions reductions for the United States Climate Alliance,
which would require a 26 to 28% reduction below 2005 emissions levels by 2025. As of the latest emissions data, which is through 2015, we're only 2% below our 2005 levels. So we've got the next 6 years to also significantly bend that curve down. This graph shows our historic emissions in the blue. You'll see that as of 2015, we're at about 10 million metric tons of greenhouse gas pollution, as measured in carbon dioxide equivalent. It's a weird term, million metric tons, carbon dioxide equivalent. What does that actually mean? 1 million metric tons of GHG pollution, greenhouse gas pollution, is the equivalent of burning 2.3 million barrels of oil. So as a state, approximately 10 million metric tons of greenhouse gas pollution is about 23 million barrels of oil. People like to talk about Vermont being small or emissions, being small in the grand scheme of things. That's still a lot, and we still have to do our part to reduce that number. If you see that green line, those right here are those dots show what we would have had to do if we were to meet the statutory goals that the legislature set for emissions reduction. We have missed them by a very wide margin. These ones out here on the blue line show the emissions reduction targets that are in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and the one that's out here a little bit more in the northeast quadrant, that's where we'll have to be to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. Whichever goal you choose to work from, the statutory goal, the Comprehensive Energy Plan goal, or Paris, the story is the same. We need to rapidly, radically bend that curve downward if we're going to meet this commitment. This shows where our emissions come from. And the green bars show our energy sectors. Over 80% of Vermont's greenhouse gas pollution comes from our use of energy. Over 70% of it comes from how we get around, and primarily how we heat our buildings. I mean, that's thermal broadly in that second bar, building thermal, but it's primarily about how we heat. Because that's where the fossil fuel use is. It's gasoline and diesel for on-road vehicles and passenger vehicles primarily, and it's fuel oil, and it's propane, and natural gas, and other fossil fuels for how we heat our homes. So we've got to focus there. Not only are those the largest sources of our emissions, if you look at why have our emissions been increasing, so what our emissions are doing, it depends on the baseline year you choose to use. So the Paris Agreement looks at 2005, which was like our peak of emissions. But if you look, most international agreements, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others, they use 1990 as the base year. And if you do that, our emissions are up 16% since 1990. And when you look at where our emissions have gone up, it's not the electricity sector, it's not agriculture, it's not waste management. Over 2/3 of our emissions increase has come from the transportation sector. And the next largest is in residential and commercial. That's really the building thermal sector. There's many reasons for this. One, this graph shows changing patterns in terms of the vehicles that people choose to buy. So this is a long-running trend. This is just data from the last 4 years. When Vermonters buy new cars, we buy about 35,000 to 40,000 new vehicles every year. 4 years ago, about 70% of those vehicles were SUVs or light trucks. Last year, 80% were. So even as fuel efficiency standards are increasing, you don't get the benefit of emissions reduction if people instead keep choosing bigger and bigger cars. So that's one reason. I also think it's really important that when we talk about emissions in Vermont, we do it in a Vermont context because we're very different than the rest of the country. Oftentimes you see national media and they talk about emissions and they will use the terms electricity and energy interchangeably as though the entire energy or climate story is about how we generate electricity. It's incredibly important. It's the backbone of our progress. But in Vermont, again, 43% of our emissions come from transportation. One of the reasons that conversation happens nationally is that for a long time, electricity generation was the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's now changed. The latest data shows that transportation nationwide is the biggest source. But in Vermont, we've always had, no matter how you measure it, relatively clean and low-emitting electricity sector compared to the rest of the country. And so we have this special responsibility where we need to focus on how we use energy for how we get around and how we heat our buildings and homes. This looks at energy use overall. Again, we're about 19 or 20% renewable as a state. This is data from the Public Service Department. And these pie charts are scaled in size of energy use. So most energy is in transportation, and that is the least renewable, most fossil fuel dependent sector we have, then the thermal sector, and then the electricity sector. I'm going to kind of breeze through these. If there's questions, Joey mentioned there'll be Slido. I'll be happy to come back to some of these. This slide breaks down that green portion of the pie, the renewable portion. What's in that? You know, in transportation, it's a very small sliver that's electric vehicles. Actually, most of that renewable is ethanol. And it's important that we look at, you know, what are these renewable sources of energy? Because renewable on its own doesn't necessarily mean low emissions. If you look at the life cycle analysis of corn-based ethanol, it is not a good thing. And similarly, you know, different types of wood use have different emissions profiles, which is also important to look at. But most of the renewable energy in our thermal sector is cordwood or wood chip or wood pellet heating. And then the electricity sector, this looks at post-REC or post-renewable energy credit accounting in compliance with the state's renewable energy standard. Shows that the vast majority of our electricity generation comes from hydro. All right, so that's the kind of quick overview on emissions and energy. One of the things that, since EAN as an organization in service of the network, we don't lobby on any policy. So instead, what we look to do is identify peer-reviewed research on proven and available technologies and best practices for ways that we know we can reduce emissions to get to these state goals. And so we ran an analysis starting with the targets for adoption of different key measures or technologies in the Comprehensive Energy Plan. Things like electric vehicles, cold climate heat pumps, home weatherization. And we plugged in those numbers from the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and we found it doesn't get you to Paris. It doesn't get us to the emissions reduction commitment that Governor Scott made. And so what we did is we proportionally increased each of these measures until we could. And what this analysis shows is that, well, first of all, this isn't a menu of options. It's not you pick one of those bars and that gets you there. We have to do all of them or their equivalent. It's also not meant to be a prescription. We're not saying this is the way that it has to happen. We started with the Comprehensive Energy Plan targets. We increased them a bit based on what we could find in the peer-reviewed literature. But it's entirely possible you could map out your own path that has a little less emphasis on one, but you would have to increase in another area to get the same overall 2.5 million metric ton reduction. You'll see on the bottom there, it shows the latest status for comparison, for reference of where we stand.
They might not be able to see. Will you let them know we'll share the slides?
If you can't see, I recognize there's a lot of like data in small print potentially. If you can't see, we will have the slides up on the VECAN website, and a lot of this is in the annual progress report, which there are paper copies of upstairs and down here as well. So what that looks like is rapid market transformation, especially across the transportation and thermal sectors, including this is the orange shows you our historic rate of homes weatherized. The green shows what we would have to do to hit that target in the Path to Paris analysis. This shows advanced wood heating systems as part of the solution. This shows heat pump systems, and this shows electric vehicles. So we have, but the good news is that any new successful technology often follows a consumer adoption curve that looks just like this. Here is what happened with solar. When you have new technologies and you have the right public policy and regulatory environment, you can create stories like this, as we did with solar PV in Vermont. Now we have to continue building on that progress and not take our renewable electricity generation for granted, but we also have to set up similar frameworks so that we can see that same rate of progress in terms of efficient and renewable heating and transportation. Just for a sense of context, when you see these numbers, like 90,000 electric vehicles by 2025, I think it helps to have a sense of how many new vehicles are sold in Vermont every year. 35 to 40,000. There's actually 2/3 of the vehicle sales in Vermont every year are used. And so what that 90,000 electric vehicles would look like, for instance, is about 1/3 of all new cars purchased in the next 6 years, a little more than 1/3, being EVs. We're not on that rate right now, but there are new models coming out every year. There are more incentives. and it is certainly, the technology is available. The fascinating thing about where we stand right now is if we looked at baseline data from 2010, less than a decade ago, there were fewer than 100 electric vehicles in Vermont. There were no cold climate heat pumps in Vermont. The good news is that the best practices in terms of retrofitting homes and making them weatherized and more efficient, and in terms of the options to move to efficient and renewable heating and transportation have arrived. Now it's a question of getting the policy and regulatory framework right so we send the right market signals and provide the incentives so that we can do in those sectors, again, what we have done in the electricity generation sector. So this is my favorite graph in the annual progress report because it tells a story about the important role of policy and regulation in terms of setting market signals and in terms of providing incentives to move the market. Most of Vermont's progress in becoming more renewable and reducing emissions in the electricity sector have come because we've passed policies and regulations targeted at the electricity generation sector. Everything from net metering to the Renewable Energy Standard to our participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a cap and invest program that capped emissions from electricity generation. Those generators had to pay for allowances if they went above their pollution limits, and then Vermont invested those funds primarily in weatherizations that have saved Vermonters millions of dollars. So what you see on this graph is the different sectors of the economy in which sectors have had emissions from them capped. In Vermont, we only cap emissions from the electricity generation sector, which is 10% of our emissions. In California and in Quebec and in British Columbia, there's a different model. It is an economy-wide cap, or at least a cap on emissions from across many more energy sectors. You see that California also, and Quebec, our neighbor to the north, cap emissions from the heat, the thermal energy sector, from the transportation sector. And that greenhouse gas emissions are greenhouse gas emissions, regardless of which sector they come from. So what we're doing in Vermont right now is the equivalent of trying to meet this challenge, not with just like one hand tied behind our back, but two hands tied behind our back. Because we're not requiring emissions reduction and providing the market signals and incentives to transform the heating and transportation sectors yet. And this is what the story has been for California. You see that vertical blue line that shows when California joined the Western Climate Initiative. That's their cap and invest program for economy-wide emissions reduction. You see after that, their greenhouse gas emissions went down even further, and it certainly did not, I'm not going to make a causal relationship here between their emissions policy and their GDP, but they've had it certainly did not harm them. They have had one of the strongest performing economies in North America. The same story is true in Quebec. After they joined the Western Climate Initiative, their emissions went down even further, and their economy continued improving. And that is that type of story is what is possible in Vermont for a number of reasons. I want to look at this from an economy perspective, both at the personal budget level and for Vermonters and in terms of our statewide economy. So the first story here, this shows the different costs of ways to heat our homes historically. The highest cost, most price volatile way to heat your home is with propane first and with fuel oil second. If instead, ideally it's in a weatherized efficient home, you are heating your home with wood pellets, cold climate heat pumps, those are those bolder lines that show you're on a lower and a much more stable fuel cost. So instead of, in the middle of winter, being hit with a $500 or $600 bill for your 200-gallon fuel oil propane pickup, you're on a much more predictable, lower cost heating budget for those heating options. Let's step back and think of, so that's from the personal budget perspective. From the state, some of you may know, before I was with Energy Action Network, I served as Economic Development Director for Vermont at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. Vermont is about a $31 billion economy, and every year, depending on the wholesale to retail prices of fuels, what drains out of state is $1.5 billion to $2 billion that we spend on fossil fuel. As Joey said, we import 100% of our fossil fuel. So what we're doing with that $1.5 to $2 billion every year is sending that to places like Saudi Arabia or to Russia or other fossil fuel exporting places that don't share our values, instead of investing locally with the solutions that we have here. So 78 to 80 cents of every dollar we spend on fossil fuel drains out of the Vermont economy. Instead, it was really fascinating this year. Is anybody here from, I know Burlington Electric Department is a sponsor. BED did an analysis this year. If you spend $1 with your local electric utility, whether it's to power your electric vehicle or a cold climate heat pump, how much of that dollar stays in state? And they found very conservatively that over 50 cents of the dollar you spend with them stays and recirculates in state, and 75 cents or more stays and recirculates in the region. That is the same story with every efficient and renewable alternative that we have to fossil fuels. Weatherization, those dollars go to our neighbors, people who are actually doing the contractor labor to weatherize and improve our homes and make us more healthy and save us money. Local wood, that's supporting keeping forests as forests, it's supporting local landowners, foresters, loggers, and with electricity. We see that an energy dollar spent on efficiency, sustainable wood heat, or electricity has much more benefit to the Vermont economy than sending it all out of state, or the vast majority of it out of state to fossil fuel companies. This looks at savings from going electric. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to go through these. But these add up to big numbers because of how much money we spend on the highest cost, most volatilely priced fuels, which are gasoline and diesel and propane and fuel oil. Switching to electric can save massive amounts of money individually and as a state. And this has an important jobs impact. We've added over 4,000 clean energy jobs in Vermont in the last 5 years. These are jobs that on average pay about $27 an hour, which is about $7 an hour more than the average median wage in Vermont. So this is a bright spot in the Vermont economy. And this is weatherization contractors, this is renewable energy installers, and increasingly, hopefully, it will be more efficient and renewable jobs in the transportation and heating sector as well. So we recently did an initiative where we looked at what are the barriers and gaps to Vermont meeting its energy and climate goals. And what we found, as I said earlier, is that right now it's not the technology. We have a lot of the technology. It's not the financing. Anybody who wants to get a low or below market interest rate loan or some of the non-government based incentives are there to help people make the switch. What is missing is the market signals that we can only send through a policy and regulatory framework that in some way caps emissions and uses incentives, carrots, what the Upper Austrians refer to, how they transformed their heating sector, carrots, sticks, and tambourines. We need a combination of those things. Norway has done it by following that model. Not only did they set a goal, they put policies in place to ensure that they met them. Now, over 60% of new vehicles sold in Norway are electric vehicles. You see the market share curves crossing here for fossil fuel versus electric vehicles. I just mentioned Upper Austria. They get almost 50% of their heating from renewable sources with a population about twice that of Vermont, similar climate. And again, they did it with sticks, carrots, and tambourines. You can't transform a market without the policy and regulatory framework that sets the rules of the road and sends those market signals. And so what this group found, and what we found across our network, is that right now, technology is important, capital mobilization is important, the money to do these things. But right now, at this moment in time, what is probably the most important missing ingredient is a policy and regulatory framework to help transform our total energy economy, not just the electricity sector. And that we need to do that through focusing on those things, policy, but we also need to do it through greater public engagement. As I said, a lot of these technologies that allow us to move into the future have only emerged in the last decade. And a lot of Vermonters are still learning about the opportunity to embrace them and to save money with them. So with that, I think the main takeaway points are that we can't take our electricity sector for granted. It has been the backbone and the foundation of the progress that we've been able to make as a state towards some of our renewable energy goals and has helped reduce emissions. But if we're going to meet either of these goals, we really need to start focusing increasingly on transportation and thermal. We have the solutions, we have the technology to do it now, but we need to start immediately ramping them up with a policy and regulatory framework that does that and that provides incentives for Vermonters to do so affordably and equitably. And that when we do this, again, this is a opportunity disguised as a challenge. This is going to save a lot of Vermonters money, and it's also probably the strongest economic development strategy that we have for Vermont for the next decade. We've seen that in the 4,000 jobs in the clean energy sector in the last 5 years, but you also see it when you stop sending $1.5 billion to $2 billion to out of state every year because of our dependence on polluting fossil fuels. So we have a major opportunity here that's not just to meet a challenge and overcome a crisis, but to more sustainably grow Vermont's economy in a way that leads to greater shared prosperity and ideally helps do so equitably so that every Vermonter is brought along in every region of the state. So thank you for this time. I just hit 30 minutes and I hope we still have 15 minutes for any questions on Slido. Thank you.